The last country that we're going to talk about in regards to absolutism and the rise of absolutism is England. And England ultimately is going to be a failed absolute monarchy, and we'll talk more about the failed aspect of that later on in another lecture. But for now, we're going to talk about how they try to strengthen their power and how they do for some time have absolute control or close to it. And so what gives someone or some institution the ability to rule? Ultimately, one major thing that it boils down to is the power of the purse, right? Which is the ability to raise and possess money. If you don't have the money and the supplies to, say, wage a war or to pay your people or things like that, you're not going to have the power. And so as long as you have wealth and money, you can kind of remain independent as a monarch, right? Remain independent and keep control. And so that is an important aspect of this story about absolutism in England. And we're going to come back to that as well. And Parliament, right, passes something called the Act of Supremacy. And this Act of Supremacy declares that the king becomes the head of the Church of England. So again, in the Protestant Reformation, before that, England was Catholic, but the Protestant Reformation and a man named Henry VIII leads to England becoming Protestant, and eventually the king or the monarch is appointed the head of the Church of England. So now they have one way to gain control is through appointment of bishops and controlling the religious aspect of life in a country. And that's one thing they do. And on top of that, the English monarchy at this time was wealthy. With beginning in the 1600s, they have beginnings of colonies across, in the New World and in Asia. And trade makes the monarchs wealthy, and so when they're wealthy, there's less of a need for them to call Parliament. And Parliament is the representative body in England. It's where they would, they are called to kind of raise taxes, things like that, to raise money. And at this time, in the 17th century, the 1600s, Parliament is really largely the wealthy middle class and also the nobility. And so the less the king has to call these people, the less they have to rely on them, the better from the king's perspective. Eventually, a monarch named Charles I is in charge, and he gets England involved in too many wars, and so he needs money. And so when he needs money to finance these wars and other things, he's forced to convene Parliament. All right, and in England, there's kind of a long history of resistance to absolutism. And so this Charles I calling Parliament will be one aspect of that. But as early as the 1200s, 1215, you have the Magna Carta that's signed, and that forces the monarch to kind of create the Parliament to begin with and allow the House of Lords, right, the nobles, to have a say in what happens. In 1628, Parliament, with this petition of right, this is now going back to Charles I, forces him to agree to this document before giving any money, right? And again, it kind of outlines certain rights that the Parliament and its representatives should have. So again, that kind of limits some of his ability to rule. What we're going to focus on a little bit is the English Civil War, which occurs as a result of Charles I. It leads to someone named Oliver Cromwell, who him and his forces actually have Charles I beheaded. Eventually, the monarchy is restored later on. And later on as well, you have the English Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution. So there is this long history, going back centuries in England, that kind of resists this move towards absolutism. But it doesn't mean that monarchs don't try and that they don't periodically have success at being absolute monarchs. So one house of monarchs at the time was the Tudor house. They eventually will kind of die out and a new branch will take over. But they're kind of involved with they're the ones that lead the Protestant Reformation. So King Henry VIII was part of the Tudor Kings, which gives, the king the head of the English Church, also known as the Anglican Church, which still exists today. So today Queen Elizabeth II is actually the head of the Anglican Church, technically. Yeah, that's Henry VIII. Henry VIII is famous for breaking away with the church because he wanted to divorce his wife, who couldn't produce a child for him, and so he wants a divorce. The Pope doesn't grant it to him, and so he says, "Well, I'm creating my own church," and he does. He goes on to be married 6 times. Right, his first wife's divorced, second wife he has beheaded, his third wife dies, his fourth wife is also divorced. His fifth wife is also beheaded, and his last wife is the one that manages to survive it all. So, complicated man, this Henry VIII. He had no male heirs. The only heir he had was a female woman, Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth becomes the Queen of England. She consults with Parliament just to kind of keep them, at bay, keep them from getting too restless. But she only asks for money once, right? So otherwise, she's relatively independent. So while she consults with Parliament, she doesn't necessarily need them, right? Only one time does she ask them for money. This is Elizabeth I. She's one of the most famous queens of England. It's interesting because we've talked about how during this time period you would think most rulers would be men, and they were, but we have the third example we've talked about in the past few lectures of a powerful female ruler of a country during this time period, right? We had Mary Teresa, we had Catherine the Great, now we have Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I was known as the Virgin Queen. She never was married, and in fact, one of the colonies in the New World, Virginia, is actually named in honor of her, right? The Virgin Queen of Virginia. And keep in mind that during all this while all this is happening, right, this rise of absolutism, we also have in the New World, in North America, you have the development of colonial possessions by France, by England, by Spain. These major colonial powers are also absolute monarchs that we've been discussing. She dies in 1603 with no heir. Some distant relatives from Scotland, known as the Stuart House, takes control. And the Stuarts come in, and one of the rulers, James I, kind of promotes this idea of divine right, which we've talked about, and he wants to kind of create an absolute monarchy. However, he is forced to ask Parliament for money, and so that kind of limits his ability to do so. Another ruler of the Stuart House is Charles I, and we mentioned this idea that of the petition of right, when Charles I is desperate for money, he's forced to kind of concede some things to Parliament. And so the petition of right essentially says that he needs permission from Parliament to raise taxes. So he can't just raise taxes on himself, on his own accord. He has to get the permission of the representative body, of the nobles and of the middle class. He also cannot just jail people without trial, right? That's one strong way of becoming an absolute monarch, is just imprisoning your enemies right away. He's not allowed to do that because of this petition of right. All right. So Parliament and the nobles in Parliament take advantage of Charles's reliance on him, and they refuse to disband, right? So they are what we call in history the Long Parliament. For 13 years, they rule with a lot of power, kind of limiting Charles a lot during this time, right? And they refuse to kind of dismiss and go back home. They stay in session, and they keep control and keep tabs on Charles I. This eventually leads to a lot of tension, and in 1642 through 1651, there's actually a civil war in England. You have what we call the Roundheads, those who supported Parliament in their efforts to kind of gain control, and the Cavaliers who supported the monarch, Charles I. The Roundheads succeed, so Parliament succeeds, and in 1649, Charles I is actually executed, which is pretty shocking, right? The rest of Europe is shocked at this because it's the first time, really, that a monarch has been executed by his subordinates, right? It's going to happen again in France in a couple decades, but it's shocking at this point, almost a century, over a century, I should say, but it's still shocking at this time. However, you would think, it would be more democratic, but that's not what actually happens. A man named Oliver Cromwell, who was a pretty radical Protestant, he's a Puritan, right? The Puritans believed that the Church of England still held on to too many Catholic traditions, and so they sort to kind of make it very thoroughly Protestant. Excuse me. And so he takes control, and he essentially creates what was called a Commonwealth, which controlled England, Ireland, and Scotland, but he is not democratic. He essentially becomes a dictator. And so, in a sense, absolutism does kind of survive in England because Oliver Cromwell rules pretty absolutely as a dictator, but he does not take the title of king. Charles I's son is Charles II, and he leads a rebellion in Scotland and Ireland, and he eventually will succeed. But Cromwell does not treat the Irish very well at all. This is a picture of Cromwell in his armor. He does not treat the Catholics very well because, as a Puritan, he is very anti-Catholic. The Puritans are very anti-Catholic, and Ireland is overwhelmingly Catholic, historically and today. In 1652, he banishes all Catholics to the western coast of Ireland, and he uses force to kind of keep the Catholics, subordinate, killing many of them. He is not allowed to. The Irish are not allowed to have public music, acting, or festivals. And at this time too, the Irish are really Gaelic, right? They speak Irish, they speak Gaelic. They're not anglicized yet. They're not English yet. And there's zero Catholic toleration. Going back to the idea of banishing the Catholic Irish to the west of Ireland, this is some images from County Kerry, which is in Western Ireland. And you might think this looks beautiful, and it is a beautiful land. But this was bad for the Irish because the Western Ireland is rocky and mountainous and not very good for farming. And so while it may look beautiful, it's not the best land to live on, right? To produce enough food to survive, or to create, have large enough farms to become wealthy. And so the Irish are forced into kind of poverty, the Catholic Irish, into poverty, and excluded from the good territory, the good valuable land. And so this is kind of a map of Ireland at the time, right? That was Protestant controlled. Yellow, the disputed territory there, right? It's mostly southern and western Europe that is not yet controlled by the British. Over time, the British will come to control all of Ireland. So we're going to stop there for today. We're going to come back later on about to discuss further England and how ultimately absolutism is not successful in there by coming back to Charles II. But that'll be for another lecture.